So, yeah, and it's cool that we're talking about Jung also because specifically shadow work is based on, we'll get into it in a second, but it's kind of a spooky place because we're nearing Halloween. And so October is right around, or Halloween's right around the corner. And so I'm stoked to be here to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, are you hearing me now?
Hearing you now, brother.
Okay, perfect. Super sorry about that. I think I unplugged it, which just stresses everybody out. Forgive me. Let's talk a little bit about just the basics of Jungian psychology. I know that we're not going to be able to really do justice to his body of work, but before we get into some of this understanding of shadow work and then talk about whether or not these things can be scientifically validated and what kind of value they have for skeptics, I'd love to have at least some sort of overview of what we're actually discussing here. What are some of the major tenets we should understand?
So one of the things, and I looked at the show notes, we're not really going to get into this today, but my favorite thing about Jung, and I think his biggest piece of work, is the idea of individuation. So if you've heard of, what's his name, Erik Erikson?
Sure.
Remember him from grad school? It's the idea of the false self and the true self. Mm-hmm. That was taken from Jung. So Jung does a lot of kind of, I guess, questioning authority and questioning kind of external authority to kind of bring in the true self of who you're supposed to become and be. So it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. But Jung has the anima and the animus. That's him. Active imagination. That's him. The collective unconscious is him. The ego is Freud, but Jung has that as well. And then there's the shadow. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to talk about it because he has so much stuff. It's so dense.
No, there's a lot here, and I'm already noticing a lot of it kind of falls into that like unverifiable sort of metaphorical language type of direction, which I think is interesting to make a little bit of space for, even if we keep it on a little bit of a tight leash. But as we're getting into this, let's talk a little bit about the shadow and what shadow work actually looks like. How does that help us understand ourselves and our own psychology?
So the shadow, I guess you could use a working definition, would be that about myself that I cannot tolerate consciously. Okay. So that means like a negative thing or a positive thing. There could be a golden shadow, or there could be like, something that is too taboo. So for a lot of your listeners, there's a lot of people who came from religion, and at one point there was a shadow that was that of doubt. What if what I'm doing is wrong? Like, what if what I believe right now is totally not true? And so repressing that question of doubt is repressing the shadow. So in that sense, that's a difficult place to go to question your entire worldview and your entire value system and reality. But going there makes it to where you are more yourself. One of the big things with Jung is he kind of says the goal in life is not to be good or to be perfect. It's to be whole and to be balanced. And so if you think about, I guess, meditating upon those darker parts of ourselves, or kind of the more taboo parts of ourselves that maybe later on wouldn't be taboo, they might make us more whole and make us better at critical thinking.
Yeah, working with this kind of community, folks who are likely to watch this show, people who either because of religion or some other force feel deeply ashamed about maybe their gender, about their orientation, or even just their kinks and their sexual and romantic interest in these kinds of things. I do a lot of work that is focused around sort of mindful self-awareness, around mindful self-compassion, and these different strategies for, I guess, embracing some of those pieces of ourselves that we might
Yeah.
be kind of blinded to because they're inconvenient, because we don't really want them in our lives. The work of folks like Tara Brach or Kristen Neff, as they talk about like the trance of unworthiness and these kinds of things. Does that line up with Jung's notion of the shadow, or do I have it wrong?
I think it does. Because if you think about unworthiness, like where does that come from? Where would unworthiness come from other than the shadow, right? Other than that place that you just kind of lodge it away. It's called the shadow because you don't see it. It's called the shadow because you repress it. You put it in the closet. You put it deep in a dark place where there's like cobwebs and spiders and shit. So bringing it out feels uncomfortable, and so shadow work looks like, well, I'm going to explore this thing that I don't like to talk about, that I can't tolerate consciously, like I said before. And so a lot of times whenever you have a therapist who's very direct with you, they'll say, Christy, I've noticed that whenever we talk, you kind of look the other way and you don't address a certain problem. That's addressing your shadow. Mm-hmm. But then also likewise with your partner, like if your partner is like, Christy, you are so funny and I don't think you realize it. That's the golden shadow. That's a good thing. It's like bringing it to consciousness. I think the one thing about the shadow that's interesting in that light is that you can't really, I guess you could, but you can't really fully go there without someone else. You kind of need to have a third party.
I hear that. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, so to that end, I mean, we don't have to get into technique, but what does shadow work look like in a therapy office? I mean, you mentioned that example of kind of calling out maybe something that we're looking to avoid, but yeah. Where else does that go?
Well, you've heard of the phrase "name it to tame it."
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Is that DBT? I think is what says that. So whenever you call out something, you become aware of it. It stops having power over you. Mm-hmm. The first step is to kind of be aware of what's in the shadow, and then there's a process that you go through. Like, you can either say, "No, fuck that, I'm not going there," or you can say, "Yeah, that's what I want to do," or you can negotiate. So like, if your partner were to say, "Christy, you're really funny. You should tell more jokes." Just dumb example, but you could either say, "You're right. I'm going to tell so many jokes," or you can say, "No, you know me. I'm a serious guy. I'm so serious." Or you can say, "Well, sometimes there's an appropriate time to tell jokes, and sometimes there's not." That's an example of like the method or the procedure of shadow work is seeing how you want to integrate it into your life. But it has to come from that first place of name it to tame it to understand that it's there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there anything that you might highlight for us that people can take away from this conversation to just become more aware of their own shadow? I mean, outside of counseling, how can people take some of these ideas and maybe cultivate some curiosity about themselves, or perhaps about the things that they look away from in themselves?
I mean, there's multiple techniques. There's like the idea of dream work is always good, of kind of getting out of your element and seeing an abstract place. I think ultimately, maybe we should back up a little bit, because maybe I should define what the ego is before we go into that. So the ego is kind of defined in Jungian terms as like that navigation tool. It's kind of your perception of reality. So it's like, I am this. So if I know that I'm this, that's coming from the ego. It's not a bad thing. It's just kind of how we perceive the world. So if you think that you're like super awesome, then you have a overinflated ego. And if you think that you're like not very cool, then you have an underinflated ego. So that we actually need the ego. It's not a negative thing. That's the main contention I have with the New Age movement is saying kill the ego. I think we need the ego because we need to kind of be able to survive in this world. So anyway, the ego does need to step aside for us to grow. So if I just think, I'm Andy, I only listen to this type of music, I only like these type of movies, I only like to do this thing in the bedroom with my partner, then like we're never going to grow or expand. And so that's the tension there, is the ego versus the shadow. So techniques is what you asked me about. It's kind of like trying to introduce play, I guess, or getting out of an element. I know, Christy, you and I shared the same supervisor, Jen, and she told me a good technique to do with a client, if you're the therapist, is to write a question with your dominant hand to answer with a non-dominant hand. And that's an intervention that is a good way to kind of get you out of your left brain, which is kind of that concrete ego place, and get more
out
into
of your
abstract
routines.
place.
Introduce a little bit of like chaos and entropy as a way of perhaps getting at things from a different angle.
100%. And that's a therapy technique. But you can do that if you're journaling. That's just essentially active imagination. But the brain likes that kind of stuff. The brain likes new information and expanding. So neurons that fire together wire together, baby.
Yeah, I don't want to get too down a rabbit hole, but I think it's worth stressing that our brains can be kind of lazy bastards sometimes. They're always looking for shortcuts. They're always looking to find ways to avoid doing extra work, which is great. It's why we're able to have this incredible computer that we carry around with us all the time. But when you use the same shortcuts, you start to get these sort of like automatic stimulus response.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of curiosity and a lot of innovation and exploration of other possibilities. And so there are pieces of ourselves that get kind of locked away.
Yeah. I mean, even in a physical sense, I mean, neuroplasticity, right? Yeah. I remember reading that seniors should be learning new languages. And that, I guess, essentially, maybe you could argue that's shadow work. Mm-hmm. Maybe not. Who knows? I'm not an analyst. I just like this stuff.
So what are some of the benefits of this type of self-understanding? I mean, what kind of results do we see in folks that, that really dedicate themselves to this kind of work?
Yeah, I think the biggest benefit is, like I said, individuation. Trying to find an inner authority that's not based upon what other people say, but based upon what you think is true. One of the big cornerstones of Jung is the difference between a sign and a symbol. And he says we need to be living a symbolic life. So a sign would say, green means go, red means stop, right? But a symbol kind of means, what does a star mean to you? What does your phone mean to you?
This is where your archetypes start to come in.
This is where your archetypes start to come in, and that's where like your personality starts to shine, because you bring in what your associations are with that thing. So whenever you start thinking symbolically instead of as signs, then your life becomes less reductive, I think, because you look beyond what you're, I guess, seeing right in front of you. Yeah.
Well, so how can this embracement of our shadow or shadow-based counseling practices and these sorts of things, how do they help us to become better romantic partners? How do they impact our marriages or our relationships?
Yeah, I mean, like I was saying earlier, if you do shadow work, the best way to do it is with someone else. Because the problem with the unconscious is that it's unconscious.
Sure.
You can't see it. And so having someone call you out on what's going on in a very healthy, kind way can help you individuate and grow. I really, truly believe that relationships should be there to help us emphasize who we are, and that we should be more ourselves than we were before we were with that person. And that's I think that's a Jungian perspective of saying, you know, Christy, you like to do this thing, so I want you to do this thing. How can I make this work for you and not have that negatively impact my life?
Yeah, I mean, I remember a conversation with my own therapist not that long ago where we were talking about conflict in my relationship and how, you know, there was just that porcupine's dilemma of two people trying to come together to huddle for warmth, but constantly poking each other in the eye, you know, struggling to make it fit. And you know, my therapist just asked me sincerely, like, is this relationship serving you? Like, is this something that you want to be a part of? And my honest gut level response was, if I'm not in this relationship dealing with this issue right now, then in a year or 5, I'm going to find myself in a different relationship working out the exact same problem in myself. You know, this is something that I need to do, but that I don't know that I can do on my own. How does that line up with the way you see this?
100%. Jung's theory originally was called complex theory because he's the guy who created complexes. I forgot to mention that earlier. So, you know, I think that complexes and complex theory could align really well with attachment theory right now.
Yeah, can you walk the audience through what we mean by that idea of a complex? I know people might be familiar with terms like an inferiority complex or something along
Napoleon
those lines. What
complex.
are we talking about? Yeah, what do we mean when we say those terms?
So when we say those terms, to my understanding, what we're meaning is the patterns by which we have adopted in relating to other people throughout our nurturing in our life. So I might have a complex about failure or a complex about rejection. And that's not my current, you know, what is today, October 14th, issue with my partner. That's me as a 35-year-old man bringing all this shit to the surface. And so these complexes stay with us and they continue kind of haunting us, to kind of go with the Halloween theme, like ghosts. And the way that we get out of that is through taking away their power, which is through working it out with our relationship. Which is healing trauma or attachment wounds, essentially.
Bringing something out of the unconscious and up to the surface where it can get a little bit of light on it and kind of maybe wither under that light if it's something that isn't serving us. Do I have the model?
100%. I mean, have you ever been in an argument with someone and you're in a complex and they're in a complex, and then all of a sudden, like, you kind of snap to it and you go, what are you talking about? Because what you're talking about is not what I'm talking about. And your actions and your reactions of what I'm saying are like totally not rational. And I'm not rational either. Where are we? That's when we're like caught in a complex. Totally. And if you're sitting at home and, you know, you're isolated. So we're in COVID still. If you're isolated, it's hard to get out of that head spin. And that's why therapy is great, because your therapist can kind of help you through that. That's why friendship is good too. It doesn't have to be romantic.
Yeah. So talk to me then about some of this like sexual shame that we're discussing and how that might be at play here. If you have a secret desire for a particular type of sexuality, or if you were spending a lot of your life in the closet and these different things, how does that impact your shadow, or how can this type of work maybe offer some healing in those spaces?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about like the brilliant nature of the way that we sustain life on the planet, it's through sex, which means play.
Sure. Yeah, I love that notion of conceiving of sex as a form of mammalian play. That's a drum that I like to beat a lot on this show. And
Yeah.
I don't know how many therapists, honestly, really have that conceptualization of it.
It's just play. And it's so funny thinking about, if someone has stoic parents, them playing, there's a old Woody Allen quote from Annie Hall, and Woody Allen is problematic, but the quote goes, they had sex, and she goes, "How was it?" And he goes, "It was the most fun I ever had without laughing," and I love that, and so anyway, I'm getting somewhere with this. So, play is what we do when we're in the bedroom. We're playing, and so if you have something that's repressing you, that's like way down, that's stopping you, like maybe let's put it in a different context of just like simple play. Maybe you really want to play with the green shovel when you're doing a sandcastle, but you don't want to tell your friend, "Can I use your shovel? I really want to use your shovel." That's shadow work, is getting the courage to feel comfortable to finding a way to play better. And so not doing shadow work like really impacts the way that we have sex, our intimacy, play. And so that there's that, but then also as far as identity goes, if someone is in the closet, well, that's shadow work in itself. Yeah.